Josephus. He's our main guy. He is the commander of the... Now, we don't know Josephus as the commander of the Galilean forces, right? But he was the Jewish commander of the Galilean forces, and he was in Jotapata when it fell. All right, we'll go ahead and get started. We might be able to get through all of the destruction of Jerusalem today. That would be excellent. So let's pick up back where we were last week. Last week we went and started destroying Galilee. Okay, Rome came in and started just crushing all the little towns and cities around Galilee. Notice this picture is above most of the activities happening north of Caesarea. Okay, everything up in here in Galilee. The Sea of Galilee is a big clue that that's what's going on. Okay. Vespasian took a little bit of different tact when he came in and started conquering things, as opposed to what happened in 66 AD. Vespasian came in and knew that he really needed to take all the regions around Jerusalem first. His supply lines needed to be okay, that kind of thing. He needed to not have people attacking him in the rear when he was going after Jerusalem, whatever. So he very methodically went in and started taking Galilee, first of all, some down in Samaria, the old nomenclature Samaria, when they took Mount Gerizim down here close to Sebast. Okay, remember Sebast was renamed in honor of the emperor. Okay, and he took a couple of coastal towns along here, all again just to shore up his supply lines. Okay, make sure things were good for his army as he continued conquering the whole regions. Okay, so back up just a little bit. I think we touched on this last week. As he was going and conquering all these things, he went and sent out, while he was doing Jotapata, while it was being besieged by Vespasian, he sent his general Trajan out and defeated the double-walled city of Japha. We'll talk about that in a little more detail in a minute. Mount Gerizim fell to Cerealis a little bit later on, and then Jotapata finally fell to Vespasian, and Josephus was captured. If I were giving a quiz, if this were a test, you would be very highly inclined to learn about Jotapata, because it was a very important town in Galilee, because that's where Josephus was captured. We'll talk about that in just a second. All right. So the battle for Jotapata and Josephus. So it was well fortified for attack by the Romans, and we see some of and this is kind of just a general way of how things went between the Romans and the Galileans, or the Romans and whoever. Okay. So the Romans would come along and do something, and the Galileans would counter that. Okay, so the Romans raised a bank, and the Galileans built city walls higher and protected their workers by stretching these cow hides over and protecting them from arrows and fire and that kind of thing. The Romans then attempted to starve them out. Food was not a problem here in Jotapata, okay, but water was. Now, we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, that they, in the movie The Dove Keepers, I think it was, on Masada, they threw their blankets and their clothes over the wall with water, showing there wasn't a problem. They may have been conflating this with Jotapata. I'm not sure. I don't remember. When we get to Masada next week, I'll try to research that and see if they actually did that at Masada. Masada, they had no problem with water. Herod the Great had dug all these giant cisterns under this giant mesa in the middle of the desert. And these cisterns underground were able to store all this water. Water was not a problem for Masada. Water was a problem for Jotapata. Okay? So Josephus had the inhabitants throw their blankets and clothes on the wall with water dripping down the walls, saying to the Romans, yeah, whatever, no problem, whatever, we're good. They really didn't have the water, though. Okay? So the Romans came in. They said, well, we can't wait them out. We can't starve them to death. They got plenty of food. They got plenty of water. So they came in with battering rams. The Jews filled sacks with chaff and hung them in front of the battering rams to blunt the force of the battering rams. Okay, the Romans came up with cut hooks, and they cut off these bags of chaff. Okay, so then they set fire to the battering rams, dropped a giant boulder on them. Okay, tit for tat. They do something, we do something. They do something, we do something. This was the manner of warfare all the way throughout the ancient kingdoms. Okay, tit for tat. Kind of that way today. You do something, we do something else to you. Okay. The Romans finally broke through the walls. What the Jews do, they poured boiling oil down on them from above. They then poured fenugreek, a native plant, boiled onto the boards they were walking up to. The Romans would be walking up, and they'd slip and fall backwards, and the guys behind them would stab them with their swords. Not a good way to go, get stabbed by your guy in the back. Okay, the Romans built finally higher towers to protect them using plates of iron, and guess what? No response. The Romans always win. City after city, town after town fell to the Romans in Galilee. Okay? Now, the battles of Japha and Mount Gerizim. So Japha was a double-walled city. Trajan went to subdue Japha. The Jews went out to battle the Romans. And the Romans overtook them, basically, and pushed them back between the walls. And the Romans got between the walls, between the inner wall and the outer wall, and they just slaughtered the Jews in between those walls. Because what did the inhabitants of the city do? They didn't want to open up the gates, because that way the Romans would come in. Well, the Jews who were fighting couldn't escape either. They were just slaughtered right there between the walls. And then, of course, the Romans ultimately took the whole city itself. The Battle of Mount Gerizim in Samaria, or the old nomenclature of Samaria. Many Samaritans fled to Mount Gerizim thinking they could escape the Romans, but they did not. It was summer. Many of them on the mountain died of thirst. Cerealis, the Roman general, offered a truce, and they turned him down, and they ended up slaughtering a bunch of Samaritans at that point. Meanwhile, back at Jotapata, after 47 days of siege, the Romans scaled the wall, slit the throats of the guards, and proceeded to decimate the city. 40,000 people were killed, 1,200 taken into captivity. The whole town was burned and demolished. But one person was missing. Josephus. He's our main guy. He is the commander of the... Now, we don't know Josephus as the commander of the Galilean forces, right? But he was the Jewish commander of the Galilean forces, and he was in Jotapata when it fell. And he was nowhere. The Romans go and they turn over the dead guy. Is that Josephus? No. This dead guy, Josephus? No. Well, he's not in these prisoners we have. Where's Josephus? Well, he and some guys had gone down into a pit. Let me tell you the story of he and his pit mates. Now, let's back up a bit in history. Who is Josephus? He was born Joseph ben Mattathiu, Joseph, which means Joseph, son of Matthias, a Hellenist Jew, and he lived from about 37 AD to 100 AD. Okay, so he was a definite witness to the fall of Jerusalem. He was the commander of the Jewish forces in Galilee. He started building walls and fences of all these cities. We're going to talk about another city later on, Gamla, that Shelley and I visited about 10 or 15 years ago. He put together a Galilean army of 60,000 footmen, 250 horsemen, equestrians, 4,500 mercenaries, and 600 personal guards. He put together quite a good army for the forces of Galilee. Half the men were in the army, half stayed home to supply the army. When Vespasian destroyed Jotapata, Josephus could not be found, as I mentioned. So they jumped into a certain deep pit, hid there for 2 days, and the Romans were out there saying, Josephus, we know you're out there. We know you're down there. And Josephus is going back and forth between he and his pitmates, saying, you know, we might as well give up. I mean, we're not going to get out of here alive unless we just give up. And they said, no, we're not going to do that. We're not going to be traitors. Back and forth, back and forth. They threatened to kill Josephus. He kept reasoning with him. Why? Why? He said, it is certainly a foolish thing to do that to ourselves, with which we quarrel with them for doing to us. That's kind of logical, right? He also said, I should esteem that pilot, a boat captain in this case, to be an arrant coward who, out of fear for a storm, should sink his ship of his own accord. Kind of a reasonable argument also for Josephus, right? Okay? His pit mates would have nothing to do with that. So they finally decided, Josephus decided, okay, we'll draw lots. Whoever gets the losing lot gets killed by the next loser. Okay? And so forth and so on. And there's a couple of different stories, different recountings of that. Okay? But basically, it ended up to where all of them were killed except for Josephus and maybe one other guy, not quite sure. So Josephus surrendered. It's kind of good that he did, because we learn a lot of history because of him. When Josephus was brought before Vespasian at the time was the general that was overtaking, okay, this is in 67 AD, okay? Vespasian was not yet emperor. That was going to happen 2 years later. So he was a great general. So he was brought before this great general Vespasian and his son Titus. And Josephus requested a private audience with them. And they granted that along with 2 of their friends. He said, you and your son are going to be emperor one day. I can see it. I can predict it, okay? So one of the friends said, okay, well, if you're such a great predictor, how come you didn't predict that Jotapata would fall in 47 days? He said, I did. Now, we're taking Josephus at his word. I mean, he wrote this, right? Okay. He said, I did. And they went out and inquired among the prisoners. Did Josephus actually say that Jotapata would fall in 47 days? And one of the prisoners said, yeah, he did. He said that. From this point on, Josephus became a traitor. If you read in the literature, that's the way he's depicted, as a traitor. In a lot of literature, I'm going to give you a couple of other perspectives, though. Okay, he would go on to become one of the most prolific writers of the war between the Romans and the Jews. Josephus' works were very likely skewed toward the Roman point of view, right? Vespasian was his patron. Titus was his patron. Part 3. Josephus, now as Roman ambassador to the Jews, begged the inhabitants of Jerusalem. A couple of years later, he begged them to give up. He said, it's not going to end well for you. My wife, my mom, my dad, my family, they're all in Jerusalem. I really want them to live, but they're not going to live unless you give up Jerusalem. He was begging Jerusalem to give up. Josephus was walking around the city one day, and someone threw a rock at him, hit him in the head, knocked him out, and they almost captured him, but he just barely escaped back to the Romans with his life. He was married 4 times. His first wife and parents were killed in AD 70 with the destruction of Jerusalem. His second wife was a captured Jewish woman given to him by the emperor in AD 70. His third wife, an Alexandrian Jew, and his fourth wife, a Jewish Greek woman from Crete. Okay. Now, was Josephus a traitor, or was he a hero? If you look at the literature, most will say a traitor. Okay. But why would Josephus write about himself as a traitor? If you have my book, I've not written anywhere in there that I'm a jerk. Shelley has a book coming out later on. But why would Josephus write that? He understood what was to come. And his goal, I think, was to preserve the Jewish nation. Okay? Now, we also have to understand the difference in literary concepts and literary thinking back then. To a lot of his readers, he may have been looked at as a hero, like the hero of Homer's Odyssey. Okay? Anybody familiar with Homer's Odyssey? You're kind of familiar with that a little bit. Odysseus, right? He was the hero, and he was a hero because he used deception to survive. That's exactly what Josephus is doing, right? So that might be why he wrote about himself as this traitor, we call him today, but as in his eyes and maybe his readers' eyes at the time, maybe the hero. And it's a good thing he survived, because we have a lot of literature that tells us about these events that we would not have otherwise. Now, his theme throughout the Wars of the Jews, if you've read that, and I have, was that evil Jewish zealots had co-opted the cities to which the Romans ultimately laid siege. And I'm going to show you some examples of that as we go on. All right, Rome's campaign of 67. Let's continue. Number 11 and 12, Vespasian sent soldiers to Japha, and many were killed in sea battles there, and Japha finally fell. The Romans camped at Cyrus. Inhabitants of Tiberias surrendered only after Jesus Japha fled to Tericheae, or Magdala. Okay? We're starting to see a theme here. We're seeing a city that resists under the rule or the tyranny of a zealot. He was a zealot. Jesus Japha was a zealot. Okay? He fled. He got out of Tiberias. So the Tiberias, after he fled, they said to the Romans, come on in. Okay? We're going to see that theme over and over and over again. After the rule of a zealot, after being a thumb on the population of a zealot, after he leaves, the city typically gives up. Okay? Next up, Tericheae fell, or Magdala. Where have we heard that term before? Mary of Magdalene. Mary Magdalene. Mary of Magdala. Okay? Was probably from here, right on the Sea of Galilee. Tericheae is about 3 miles north of Tiberias, known as Magdala. Some people from Magdala attempted to escape on the Sea of Galilee. Josephus goes through a pitiful, sickening picture of how the Romans just killed. They didn't care where they were. They killed them on the sea. If they jumped in the water, they killed them in the water. If they escaped to the shore, they killed them on the shore. Josephus tells of the bodies, the swelled up bodies in the sun, just sitting there and just rotting and stinking. And it was just horrible events that were going on. 6,500 were killed, 1,200 old men and useless killed, 6,000 young men sent to Rome as slaves, and 30,000 sold as slaves in other places. Interestingly enough, they found a boat. Now, this boat is probably a little bit before our time that we're talking about here in the late 60s AD. But this boat they discovered in the Sea of Galilee in January of 1986. They had a severe drought in Israel in this time, in 85 and 86, and they found this boat. This was from the time, they've dated it between around 40 BC plus or minus 80 years. So this boat was in service somewhere between 120 BC and 80 40. Okay? It's kind of known as the Jesus boat. Not officially or anything, but it's kind of just known as the Jesus boat. Maybe it's a boat Jesus could have been in. Maybe it's a boat that some of the apostles could have been in or whatever. But it's in a museum, the Galilean Museum on the Sea of Galilee. Interesting story. You can read it in the book. I was recounting it, but there's actually another whole book on it that we bought when we were there. But it's an interesting story how they restored this. It was the consistency of wet cardboard when they found it. And then the rains came, and the Sea of Galilee started rising. What do? Panic! That's what you do! So what they did is they surrounded the boat, and they finally got it surrounded, and they sailed it off down the coastline there to just off the Galilean Museum, and they finally got it inside where they could start restoring it. And they spent 14 years restoring the thing. They turned this wet cardboard floppy thing into a boat that you can go see today. They determined a lot of things about the boat. They found a lot of pottery and sherds and things like that around the boat that they could tie it, and through carbon-14 dating, they could tie it to this year. Very interesting stuff, okay? You read about that in the book. Notice also, we're talking about Tiberius here. Notice that the city is spelled with an A, Tiberius, versus the emperor spelled with a U. So if you go search for the emperor and you type in Tiberius, you're not going to find him because he's a U. Just a little point of interest there. All right, moving along. Romans campaign of 67, number 15. Gamla fell to the Romans. Okay, here's Gamla. We went there when we were over there in 2013. Okay, it's called Gamla because camel hump. Camel is gamel in Hebrew, or gamal in Hebrew. Okay, it looks like a camel's hump. We were standing where Vespasian stood when he was getting ready to take Gamla in the Galilee. He was up there with his big guns, and he was raining down these missiles down on Gamla. Okay, and they finally broke through and took over. Interesting stories about how a lot of people died when the way the roofs, the town was built on this slope. Okay, so the porch of one house would be the roof of the next house, and so forth and so on. And the Romans were climbing up to take over the city. It talks about how all these roofs started collapsing, and the Romans just got crushed, and the inhabitants too got crushed underneath the fall, basically the collapsing domino fall of the city. It was discovered in 1968 after the Six-Day War and excavated 3 to 4 years between 1977 and 2000. Very interesting place to go because after the war in 67, Gamla was deserted. And it just got covered up by dust and debris and whatever, and they didn't discover it till later. So if you want to go see something that was really like the way it was when it was, you can go see that today in Israel today, in the northern Galilee. We asked if it was okay to drive around up there, and it was, so we did. So Gamla's a pretty cool place. All right, next up, Mount Tabor fell to the Romans. Next up, Gischala surrendered to the Romans. After another, here's our theme. John, a zealot, had his thumb on the population. He escaped. And then the doors are open. The gates were open, right? And the Romans came in. Next up, Jamnia. We start going down the coast. Azotus fell to Vespasian. Okay? So at this point, we've pretty much taken over all of Galilee, some cities on the coast, and a little bit in Samaria with Mount Gerizim. Okay? Let's talk about the civil war of the Zealots. Before Rome ever set their collective feet into Jerusalem, the Zealots pretty much did them in. Okay? So, Jerusalem became the melting pot of all these people. Remember, everything was being destroyed by the Romans. A city fell here in Galilee, where did the people go? Well, Jerusalem. It was a heavily fortified city. Where a city fell here, where did the people go? Jerusalem. Also, when Jerusalem fell, it was Passover. Oh, bad. That's one of the annual or required feasts to go to Jerusalem if you were a Jew. We're going to talk about the feast later on in a few weeks, what the required feasts were to travel to Jerusalem and what all a feast meant, and all that history and everything, so stay tuned for that. But anyway, a lot of people were in Jerusalem for Passover when the Romans took over. So many were innocent, but many were zealots. who came from other conquered towns and cities, which we've seen. Okay, there was a three-way fighting between and among the Zealots in Jerusalem, between Eleazar, Simon, and John. Their only agreement was kill anyone who tries to escape Jerusalem. Not nice people. So as I said, Jerusalem fell from within before Rome even came along. The food supplies were burned. There were these warring factions of Zealots. And again, their only agreement was against the population. Okay? The citizens came to want an external war with Rome versus this internal war going on with the Zealots. Okay? Religious authority broke down. The Zealots chose a new high priest by lot. Turned out to be the last high priest because the high priest is associated with the temple, right? When you don't have a temple, you don't need a high priest anymore. So the high priestdishness, the high priesthood ended in AD 70 with the fall of the temple, with the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. Okay, so they chose the last one by lot. They took up residence in the temple. These were not nice people. Now we see a struggle develop between a former high priest, Annas II, high priest emeritus. You don't remember this, but he ruled for only 3 months. Okay, he's the one that killed James, the brother of Jesus. Okay, so he got kicked out after 3 months, but he was a high priest emeritus, and he started rallying the people against the Zealots. And he was very successful until he wasn't, okay? Turns out that he was against John, and he ended up having John and his zealot kinsman holed up in the temple at one time, and the Zealots didn't have anywhere to go. They knew their days were numbered, so they appealed to the Idumeans. And the Idumeans came in and started taking, just destroyed everything, and finally let the Zealots out. If that had not, I always ask the what-if questions. If that had not happened, what would have happened? If the Idumeans had not come along and the Zealots had been destroyed at that point, probably the Jews would have opened up Jerusalem to the Romans and said, come on in. We don't like it, but it's better than killing us all, right? Some of us might go into slavery or whatever, but come on in. But the Idumeans came along and took over and killed a bunch of people and let the Zealots out. And thus, the Romans ended up destroying Jerusalem. Now, we see a kind of a parallel to that. Back, remember when Alexander the Great came along? He was going to Jerusalem. He was mad. Jerusalem would not help him. Jaddua, the high priest, would not help him. So Alexander the Great was marching toward Jerusalem, and Jerusalem opened the doors. All the priests came out in their robes, their flowing robes, and Alexander said, I saw this in a dream. Remember all that story? Oh, that's a lot of dusty neurons. We have to go back and remember Alexander the Great. I'm so sorry. But you can watch it on YouTube. Go check that out on YouTube if you've gotten that story. All right. So we see a bunch of carnage happen then. Rome's campaign of AD 68. Okay. Vespasian continued to clean up everything around. Notice Caesarea here. Everything we looked at in the previous charts was up here. Okay. Now everything is down here in Judea, in Samaria and Judea and below. Okay. Which is the kind of the middle part of Judea. Remember, the region got renamed. Okay. As I mentioned, Jerusalem became the magnet for all these zealots, far and wide, and a bunch of other people too that were fleeing the Romans, just trying to stay a step ahead of the Romans. Okay. So that chart's in the book on page 319. So first of all, the Idumeans wreaked havoc in Jerusalem, as I mentioned already. Next, we see a bunch of cities fall. I'm not going to go through all the details here, 2 through 11 and number 13. And then Qumran, which is very famous for what? Dead Sea Scrolls, that's right. Qumran likely, we don't see Josephus referring to it specifically, but Qumran likely fell during this time as well. And what the Essenes do, they took the scrolls and they hid them in the caves, right? Yay, good for them because we found them. We didn't, but they found them. And there's a lot of interesting stuff there. You can go to the Shrine of the Book, part of the Israel Museum in Jerusalem today, and see these scrolls, like the Isaiah scroll. They have it completely rolled out so you can see it. So all these scrolls they saved before the Romans came in and took Qumran. Rome's campaign of 69. Vespasian cleaned up all areas around Jerusalem, but he didn't take the city yet. Again, his supply lines didn't want to be attacked in the rear, that kind of thing. He chose to let Jerusalem consume itself and save Roman soldiers' lives. He then became the 4th emperor in the year of the 4 emperors in AD 69. It did not end well for Galba, Otho, or Vitellius. Some of them lost their heads, and Vespasian came in and finally was the 4th emperor in the year of the 4 emperors, and he was the emperor for a long time after that. And then we start the Flavian dynasty. Okay, we were under the Julio-Claudian dynasty first with Octavian, the first emperor, okay, through the emperors. And then we come along to the Flavian dynasty with Vespasian, and then Titus and Domitian. Okay, we'll talk about all that Roman history here in maybe next week. Maybe we'll see. I hope. Depends on how fast we go today. Oh, we're doing pretty good. All right. Chapter 10, the Roman conquest of Jerusalem, part 3. Now, we've been talking about chapter 10 all along, but this is like the latter or the middle part of chapter 10. All right. So, Vespasian had become Roman emperor at this point in AD 70. Titus was left to do the job of taking Jerusalem. Now, he brought a bunch of legions with him. Now, a legion, we'll talk about Roman military history and the makeup of the military at some point in a few weeks. But a legion was basically, at this time, I think about 6,000 men. Then they had all their auxiliaries and support people and all that. So I'm guessing 10,000 people per legion. Titus had 4 of the legions, maybe 30, 40,000 men. Okay? Legions 5, 10, 12, and 15. Josephus, as I mentioned, became the chief negotiator for the Jews, or for the Romans to the Jews. Okay? Ambassador to the Jews. The destruction of Jerusalem was complete by August. They started in April. They finished by August on Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, the Jewish month of Av. Okay? And this was how many years? 656 years between the destruction of the temple by Nebuchadnezzar and the destruction of the temple by the Romans. Both happened on Tisha B'Av. Okay. All right. Jerusalem at the beginning of the New Testament. If you go back to my talk, I keep saying 6 months ago. It's been more like 9 months now in the auditorium in the class. Okay. I talked about the building of Jerusalem. You remember we started out with the hills and the valleys, and we started building Jerusalem on top, and we went all the way to the modern city of Jerusalem. Okay. Recall from that discussion, dust off the dirty neurons again. Recall from that discussion, Jerusalem consisted of the wall built by the Hasmoneans, by Simon Maccabeus or John Hyrcanus I, this purple wall. The second wall built by John Hyrcanus, Aristobulus I, or Alexander Jannaeus, this red wall. Of course, the Temple Mount built by Herod the Great. Okay, and then the lower city down here, upper city where the highfalutin, the priests, and the rich people lived. Poor people lived here, most likely. Okay. And these are the terms used by Josephus when we talk about the city of Jerusalem. That's what it looked like at the beginning of the New Testament. Okay? By the time Jerusalem fell, this is what it looked like. Herod Agrippa the first. Who was that, by the way? Oh, let's see. Herod the Great, generation 1. His sons, generation 2. Philip the Tetrarch, Archelaus, Antipas. Okay? Generation 3, Herod Agrippa the first. Generation 4, Herod Agrippa II. You remember that, right? Right. Somebody nod, please. Okay, yes. Yay, somebody remembers. Yay, I'm good. Okay, all right. Whenever you hear Herod in the Bible, a lot of times you're not going to be given any more information besides it's just Herod. Okay, B-D-E-L. Herod, generation 1, birth of Jesus, death of Jesus, generation 2, early apostles, generation 3. Remember James, the first apostolic martyr, killed by Herod Agrippa I, this guy. Generation 4, Herod Agrippa II, later apostles, B-D-E-L, birth, death, early, later. You cannot possibly forget now who these Herods were. So I noticed Jimmy mentioned in a sermon a couple of weeks ago, he mentioned Herod. I'm thinking, well, I know who that is because of, okay, all right. So, enough of that. All right, so the third wall, built by Herod Agrippa I, this green wall up here, only partially built, but the Jews probably built it later, before the destruction of Jerusalem, before Rome came in. Modern Jerusalem shares some of the same walls, okay, and I mentioned during my talk that you can actually go on top of these modern walls and walk around Jerusalem and look down on things going on. It's pretty cool thing. All right, so let's tear it all down. First of all, the Jews had some initial successes against the Romans, okay. Titus ended up getting cut off. You know, when you go to, I'm going to go destroy a city, what do I want to do? First of all, I want to kind of like walk around the city and say, yeah, there's a good weak point there, and yeah, we need to do this here. And so you're kind of scoping out the city. You're checking things out. Well, Titus and a few of his men ended up getting cut off from the rest of the main army. Wow. That's pretty scary for Titus, right? Okay. They barely escaped back. Okay. So the Jews were pretty giddy about this. That they were saying, yeah, we can defeat the Romans, no problem, easy peasy, okay? Well, they also deceived the Romans on several occasions and said, okay, we'll sue for peace, we'll send these people out, and they end up tricking them every time. You know, they would deceive the Romans. They would say we're going to do something, and then they would do something else. And the Romans just kind of had enough of it, okay? Now, let's talk about the miserable state of Jerusalem before the Romans captured the city. Food was a real problem. The Zealots, real problem. They took food out of the mouths of babies and infants. The people went to the sewers to find food. The people dug through cow dung to find food. They would chew on their shoes. One woman killed and roasted her baby son and ate him. There were dead bodies everywhere. The stench was unbearable. In fact, we'll talk about in just a minute, the Romans didn't even bother plundering some of the places because the stench was so bad. That is the state of Jerusalem before the Romans came in. Later, some who managed to escape were given food, and they hadn't eaten it so long they burst asunder after eating the food. Some Jews swallowed their gold coins, which seemed like a great idea at the time until they found out about it, and then it started not ending well for the people when they would go out. And you're going to get the gold coins out of people, and you're not going to wait for them to pass. You're going to just get them. You're going to stab them, get them out. Okay? Not good. Let his blood be on us and our children. What's that quote?
It's the Jews when they're calling for the crucifixion of Christ.
Yeah. Have you ever thought about that? I have, and in writing this book, I'm not sure it's ever been brought up in a sermon or anything. But yeah, some people survived, were there in Jerusalem, that were there at the crucifixion. And 40 years later, at the fall of Jerusalem. Certainly some of the children, let his blood be on our children. Well, we're going to see where Titus started crucifying 500 people a day outside the city walls of Jerusalem. Let his blood be on us and our children. Fall of Jerusalem, part 2. Okay? After 15 days of siege, the third wall was breached. Now we know this nomenclature now. It was the first wall they breached, but it was the third wall, nomenclature-wise. Okay? Legions 5, 12, and 15 moved into the city. After all, we got to go across this ditch here, the Hinnom Valley. And we don't want to do that. That's too much trouble, so we'll just move our camp, move it in there to the newly conquered part of the city. The second wall was then breached. Okay? It was breached after 5 days. Titus made a tactical error here. He breached a very narrow part of the wall for his soldiers to go in. And they were all funneled into this area going into the city, and the Jews just started attacking them, just killed a bunch of people. And Titus learned his lesson. So after a few more days, they tore down a bunch more of the wall, had a much bigger place for the Romans to go in, and he was not going to make that mistake again. Those who tried to escape were crucified, 500 a day at this point. Now my question is, why would Titus do this? Okay, when he breached the third wall, the new city, he didn't do that. He was pretty kind to the Jews. He didn't kill a bunch at that point or whatever. He said he would give them opportunity to surrender or whatever. But at this point, he started crucifying Jews. Why? Well, the answer is he learned his lesson. You give the Jews an inch, in this case, you can't trust them. Okay? He would have had to commit soldiers to guarding these Jews if he had taken them captive. Okay? He also thought that the sight of it, if he crucified people all the way around the walls of the city of Jerusalem, 500 a day, that's a lot of crosses, right? That the sight of that might make people surrender. Well, that backfired on him too. Because what the Zealots did was they brought their relatives to the wall and said, look right there. That's your son getting crucified. That's what's going to happen to you if you give up to the Romans. So Titus, thinking that it would incite them to give up, it incited them to, not a good idea. Okay, his plan backfired. Next up, unsuccessful attacks on the Antonia fortress and on the first wall. Okay, the Romans then kind of stepped back a little bit and said, okay, let's build a siege wall around. And what that does is that keeps any reinforcements out. Anybody that tries to escape, that keeps them in. Somebody tries to escape, we'll kill them on the spot. They build a siege wall around, and then they go on to the next thing. The siege wall, by the way, is 5 miles long with 13 garrisons. That's quite an accomplishment in and of itself. That's a lot of rocks that you pile up for this siege wall. Next up, the Antonia fortress was taken, number 5 there on the chart. Okay, Titus begged the Zealots to surrender, or at least change the venue of fighting. He said, let's go over here and fight instead of the temple. The Zealots were holed up in the temple, and he said, I don't want to destroy your temple. I will endeavor, he says, to preserve you your holy house. And the zealots said, no, we're good here, thank you. And that's why the temple fell. If they had done that, maybe the temple would still be around. Okay. Well, Titus ordered the temple gates to be burned. Not the temple itself. He ordered the temple itself not to be burned. He wanted to keep that as a memento to what the great might of Rome is. But a soldier frustrated with things, he ended up setting fire to one of the windows of the temple itself. And the temple burned down. And that was the end of that. So then the Temple Mount and the temple were taken. Next up, the lower city was taken. Now, the Antonia Fortress, you have the high ground. The Temple Mount, you have more high ground, right? The lower city, pretty easy to take when you have the high ground, okay? Next up, from the lower city, the upper city was taken from two directions, from the Temple Mount and then through the first wall. Titus once again appealed to the Jews and said that, we've been good to you. We've let you have your own kings of your own country, the Herods, as an example, okay? Even though they were Idumeans, they were Jews, Idumean Jews, okay? He says, we've let you keep your laws. We've even relieved you of some of the taxes. He says, we've been pretty good to you. In fact, some of this money that we've relieved you from tax-wise has been spent to go to war with us, to make preparations for war against us with our own money. And he gave him another chance, and the zealots, the people said, okay, we'll give up. The zealots said, no, we're not going to do that. All right. This is the Temple Mount model at the Jewish Museum in Israel today. Okay, this is the Antonia Fortress. This is what they took first. Notice the high ground. They could see everything down. You just stand up there with your lob. You just lob stuff down, arrows and rocks and whatever, and you take anybody out on the Temple Mount. Pretty easy peasy once you get the Antonia Fortress. Then they took the Temple Mount itself. Okay, they burned the gates of the temple. We don't know which gates they burned. Josephus just said he gave order to set the gates on fire. I don't know which ones they are. I do know there's a Nicanor gate inside the temple complex itself. There's the Beautiful Gate, which goes into the temple complex. And then there's a bunch of other gates around the temple complex too. And I'll list some of those, I think all those up there. Okay, and you can see that later in the book in chapter 12, I think it is. And then the royal stowe is here. Remember a few weeks ago when we talked about the destruction of Jerusalem and we talked about Herod's building project? I showed you all the stones on the ground, the giant boulders on the ground, that sidewalk where they pushed all the stones off the Temple Mount. This is on the far side of the Temple Mount. The Robinson's Arch is over on the far side of the Temple Mount down below, okay? So this royal stoa right here, a lot of this was pushed over onto that street below that you can go see today. All these stones, a lot of this porch here. Solomon's porch here that ran along this wall of the Temple Mount was probably pushed over the walls here. The Romans just leveled it. There's a place you can go in Jerusalem today called the Burnt House. It's 20 feet below ground. You buy a ticket. And they did excavations in 1970, and they found out that a priestly family lived there. Bar Cathros. They found a stone with the inscription Bar Cathros, or son of Cathros. This guy, this priest, is mentioned in the Talmud, an actual person that lived. They found the forearm of a young woman down here. They found a spear. This is the forearm. I looked all over this picture. I'd seen it many years ago when I was doing research for the book, and I couldn't find the picture anywhere. I think it's probably the only picture that there exists of this forearm of the woman. That is the only human remains left, they think, from the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. This is the stone weight, and this is what the house of Cathros looks like. Here's the stones, the giant boulders on the street I was telling you about, on the western side of the Temple Mount, the southwestern corner. The sight and stench were so much the Romans did not even attempt to pillage parts of Jerusalem. The only ones the Romans saved were those who were incarcerated by the Zealots. So they sent 700 of the tallest and most beautiful of the young men back to a triumph in Rome. They killed a bunch of others, sold a bunch more in slavery, had more for gladiatorial games later on where they would just kill them at random, wild beasts or whatever. The Romans killed 1.1 million, captured 97,000, 1,100 died of malnourishment. After the conquest, think of that, 11,000 died of malnourishment after the Romans conquered Rome. It's a lot of people to have died just from starvation. And don't forget that many of these people were there, just innocent people going there for Passover. The Romans only left three things. Herod's 3 towers. We talked about that when we talked about Herod the Great and all the things he created. Okay, The Romans left the three towers, Phasial, Mariamne, Hippicus, those three towers. We think one of those still exists today. The Tower of David Museum is probably the base of Phasial's tower here. So you can go see that today and tromp around outside and inside that. Jesus said, truly I tell you, not one stone will be left here upon another, all will be thrown down. And it happened 40 years after he died. We have burnt shops on the Temple Mount wall, the southern wall of the Temple Mount. Can you see these arches? Can everybody see that at all? Okay. So the arches here, the fire was so intense that it changed the character of the stone where the fire was. Okay. If you can't see the arches, I've put them in red arches here. Okay. The fire was so intense that those stones were just not the same. 2,000 years later. Wow. To the victor, the spoils. The Romans had a big time using Jewish money. When we talk about Jewish money in a few weeks, we'll talk about Tyrian shekels. Millions of Tyrian shekels were in the temple that the Romans looted. And they melted them all down into denarii to build the Colosseum, to build the Arch of Titus. There's a relief inside the Arch of Titus showing them carrying off the candlesticks and some other implements in the temple. All these Tyrian shekels melted down to denarii to pay their soldiers, to support the Roman Empire. Okay? The Jews did a lot of that. The Jews built the Colosseum in which they were to be murdered later. Kind of a bummer. Next week, we will talk about the conquest of Herodium, Machaerus, and Masada. You must be here next week. Masada is a really interesting story. Masada is a really interesting place to go. See y'all next week. Masada next week.